Hi, Charles again. In this video we'll look at market demand and discuss how changes in the various determinants of demand influence the demand curve. Moving from individual to market demand is fairly straightforward. Consider the table below. You're all familiar with Anne by now, who was our sole buyer in the market for tomatoes. Now let's imagine the market comprises just three people, Anne, Helen and Purvi. To arrive at market demand, we simply have to sum the demand at each price for the three market participants. So at a price of R1, Anne's demand is 6 tomatoes, Helen's is 4, Purvi's is 5. The total quantity demanded at R1 is therefore 15. And so on and so on. Summing for all prices, we obtain the market demand schedule in the final column of this table. Here we repeat the same exercise, but this time using graphs instead of tables. The graph on the left gives us the demand functions for all of our market participants. We have Helen over there, Purvi in the middle, and Anne on the right. Notice that all three of these market participants happen to have the same slope for their respective demand curves, although the intercepts do differ. So how do we find the market demand given these three individual demand schedules? Well, we simply sum horizontally. In other words, at each price level, we sum the value for the demand across the three individual demand curves. So taking a price of 5, we have 0 for Helen, plus 1 for Purvi, plus 2 for Anne, which gives us a market demand of 3 at price R5 per kilo. If we consider the price 1, Helen's demand is 4, Purvi's is 5, and Anne's is 6. That gives us a total market demand of 15 at a price R1 per kilo. And of course, given that we are dealing with linear functions here, all we need is 2 points to draw a market demand schedule, as illustrated on the bottom right. Now that we know how a demand curve is constructed, we can ask ourselves, how do changes in the various determinants of demand influence the demand curve? Just to recap, we said that the main determinants of demand are the price of related goods such as complements and substitutes, income in the economy, tastes, and population size. Let's consider how a price change influences demand. Now recall that the demand curve provides the relationship between the price of the good and a quantity demanded at various prices. And this is illustrated by the demand curve D given over here. If the price should change, it would change the quantity demanded. In other words, there'd be some movement along the curve. Now imagine that the market price for a given good was at A over here. The quantity demanded would then be at this point, somewhere down here. Should the price change, say, to B, in other words, there'd be a higher price, there'd then be a movement along the demand curve, and the quantity demanded would decrease to some level over here. Conversely, if there was a price decrease, so price goes down instead of up, down to C, we would then observe a higher quantity demanded, somewhere down here. The important point to note is that a price change results in a movement along the curve as opposed to a shift of the curve. What happens when we have a price change of related goods? In other words, prices of complements or substitutes changes. What would we expect to observe in the demand curve then? This slide looks at how the demand for a good changes when the price of one of its complements changes. So here we're using the admittedly dated example of video cassette recorders and video cassettes. Now clearly these two are complements. Let's say we're interested in the demand for video cassettes, which is given in the graph on the right. Let's consider what happens when there's a price change in one of its complements, its main complement, which is video cassette recorders. So initially the price of video cassette recorders is 2,000 Rand and a quantity demanded is 10,000 per period. The prices of cassettes is 30 Rand and the quantity demanded is 50,000 per period. Now let's say the price of VCRs goes down from 2,000 to 1,500. In other words, one of the complements of cassettes has a decrease in its price. We would expect the demand for cassettes to go up because the device we use to play cassettes is now cheaper. Let's see what happens. Indeed, demand does go up, but not in the same way that we observed earlier. Now, rather than a movement along the original demand curve, we have a shift of demand to the right. Because the complement is now cheaper, we expect people to demand more cassettes, and they demand more cassettes at every price level on a new demand curve illustrated here by D prime. Now let's look at how the demand for a good changes if the price of one of its substitute changes. So on the right, we are interested in the market for margarine, in the demand for margarine. One of the substitutes for margarine is butter. Now here we have an increase in the price of butter from 12 Rand to 15 Rand per kilo. And again, what we would expect is an increase in demand. And once again, we observe a shift of the demand curve, a rightward shift of the demand curve. So at each price level, there is now a higher demand for margarine because one of its main substitutes, butter, has increased in price. So some of the decrease in the demand for butter will result in an increase in the demand for margarine. Another determinant of demand is income, consumer income more specifically, and how this influences demand will depend on the type of good in question. If we are considering a normal good, then a rise in income would likely increase demand for that good. On the other hand, if we are considering an inferior good, then a rise in income will decrease demand for that good. An example of a normal good would be something like chocolate, perhaps Lindt chocolate more specifically, whereas an example of an inferior good might be something like house brand instant coffee, or something like a Tata, a cheap Tata car. What does this translate to in terms of the graphical illustration of supply and demand? Well, an increase in income will shift the demand curve for a normal good to the right, whereas a decrease in income will shift the demand curve for a normal good to the left, and conversely for inferior goods. Tastes are yet another determinant of demand, and there are several factors that can influence consumers' tastes and preferences, most notably advertising. That's why we see so much of it. It actually works. Now, clothing presents a good example of how tastes can change. For instance, fur coats were once in high demand, very fashionable and desired, but due to ethical consumption concerns, people's preferences changed, and these are no longer items that are in high demand. In this case, the demand curve shifted to the left. Population too is an important determinant of demand. And this one is straightforward. The larger the population, the greater the demand. The smaller the population, the smaller the demand, all else constant. Thus, a larger population or growing population would be illustrated by a rightward shift of the demand curve, whereas a shrinking population, and yes, there are some countries that are shrinking, would imply a leftward shift of the demand curve. Of course, in addition to the 5 determinants mentioned, there might be any manner of factors, other factors that could influence demand. 2 more examples are change in expected future prices of goods and services, as well as changes in the distribution of income in society.